Lisa thought she had found her perfect home. After years of apartment living, she finally had her own little slice of suburbia. A cozy two-bedroom house with a white picket fence and a garden where she could grow tomatoes. The neighborhood seemed peaceful enough. Kids rode bikes down the quiet streets, neighbors waved from their porches, and everyone seemed to mind their own business. That's exactly how Lisa liked it. For the first 6 months, everything was wonderful. She painted her front door a cheerful blue, planted roses along the walkway, and even made friends with Mrs. Chen next door, who brought her homemade cookies and gardening tips. The homeowners association seemed pretty laid back too. They'd send out the occasional newsletter reminding people to trim their hedges or pick up after their dogs, but nothing too strict or annoying. Then everything changed when the HOA held their annual meeting in September. Lisa didn't usually attend these meetings. She figured as long as she kept her yard neat and paid her dues on time, she'd be fine. But this particular meeting would affect her life in ways she never could have imagined. The HOA board announced they were creating a new position called Neighborhood Compliance Coordinator to help maintain property values and ensure everyone followed the community guidelines. The man they chose for this job was Detective Rick Patterson, recently retired from the local police force after 30 years of service. He seemed qualified enough on paper, and the board was impressed by his law enforcement background. They thought having a former cop keeping an eye on things would make the neighborhood safer and more organized. Rick lived just 3 houses down from Lisa, in a large colonial-style home with perfectly manicured grass that looked like it belonged in a magazine. From day one, it was clear he took his new volunteer position very seriously, maybe too seriously. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early October. Lisa was getting ready for work when she noticed something odd about her mailbox. She always arranged her mail in a specific way. Bills on the left, personal letters on the right, and catalogs in the back. But today everything was mixed up and shuffled around. At first, she thought maybe the postal worker had been in a hurry and just tossed everything in carelessly. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after that, Lisa started paying closer attention. She'd check her mail right after the postal truck left each afternoon, noting exactly how everything was positioned. Without fail, by the next morning her mail would be rearranged. Sometimes letters would be upside down or facing the wrong direction. Once she found a magazine that had been carefully placed at the very bottom of the pile, even though it should have been on top based on when it was delivered. The really concerning part was that some items seemed to go missing altogether. A birthday card from her sister never showed up, even though her sister insisted she'd mailed it. A small package containing a phone case she'd ordered online disappeared completely. When Lisa contacted the shipping company, they confirmed it had been delivered to her address, but she never saw it. She mentioned the strange mailbox situation to Mrs. Chen during one of their weekend garden chats. Mrs. Chen frowned and admitted she'd noticed some odd things too. Packages, arriving later than expected, and her grandson's birthday money from his grandmother mysteriously never reaching him. "Maybe we should mention it to that new HOA fellow," Mrs. Chen suggested. "Rick seems to take security very seriously. I see him walking around the neighborhood at all hours checking on things." That comment stuck with Lisa. She started noticing Rick's unusual patrol habits too. He'd be out at dawn, walking slowly past each house with a small notebook, writing things down. In the evening, she'd spot him again, this time with a flashlight, examining mailboxes, garbage cans, and yard decorations with the intensity of someone conducting a criminal investigation. One evening in late October, Lisa decided to test her suspicions. She set up her phone to record through her living room window, angling it toward the mailbox. The next morning she was shocked by what she discovered. The video clearly showed Rick approaching her mailbox around 11 p.m., well after the mail had been delivered. He looked around carefully to make sure no one was watching, then opened her mailbox and began going through her mail piece by piece. He held each item up to his flashlight, examining return addresses and even opening what appeared to be a catalog. He spent nearly 10 minutes at her mailbox before closing it and moving on to Mrs. Chen's house next door. Lisa's hands were shaking as she watched the footage. This wasn't some mistake or misunderstanding. Rick was deliberately going through her personal mail without permission. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was pretty sure this was illegal, really illegal. The next day she approached Mrs. Chen with the video evidence. Her elderly neighbor was outraged and admitted that she'd been missing important medical correspondence lately. including appointment reminders from her doctor that never seemed to arrive. "We need to report this," Mrs. Chen declared. "This is completely unacceptable." But when Lisa called the non-emergency police line, the officer who answered seemed less than enthusiastic about investigating a fellow law enforcement member, even a retired one. He suggested she try to work it out with the HOA first and only call back if the situation escalated. Lisa tried that approach next, scheduling a meeting with the HOA board president, a pleasant woman named Janet who lived in the neighborhood's largest house. But when Lisa explained what she'd discovered and showed the video evidence, Janet's response was disappointing. "Oh, I'm sure Rick is just being thorough in his duties," Janet said dismissively. "He mentioned that part of maintaining neighborhood standards involves checking for mail theft and ensuring mailboxes are being used properly. He's probably just looking out for everyone's security." "But going through people's personal mail isn't part of security," Lisa protested. "It's a federal crime." Janet waved her hand as if brushing away Lisa's concerns. Now, I think you're overreacting. Rick has 30 years of police experience. He knows what he's doing. Maybe you should focus on making sure your mailbox meets HOA standards instead of questioning our volunteers." Lisa left that meeting feeling frustrated and powerless. It seemed like Rick had somehow convinced the HOA board that his behavior was not only acceptable, but necessary for neighborhood safety. She was dealing with someone who had the backing of the community leadership and the arrogance that came with decades of wearing a badge. Over the next few weeks, Rick's behavior became even more bold and intrusive. He started leaving official-looking notices on mailboxes, citing residents for violations that seemed to exist only in his imagination. Lisa received a formal warning for having a non-regulation mailbox color even though her black mailbox was identical to dozens of others in the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen got cited for improper mail placement when she left a package on her porch for 30 minutes. When residents questioned these citations, Rick would point to his retired police badge, which he wore prominently on his jacket during his neighborhood patrols. He'd speak in official-sounding police jargon and reference local ordinances that didn't actually exist. Most people, intimidated by his authoritative demeanor and law enforcement background, simply paid the small fines rather than challenge him. But Lisa wasn't most people. She'd grown up in a family that taught her to stand up for what was right, and she wasn't about to let some power-hungry retiree turn her peaceful neighborhood into his personal police state. She just needed to figure out how to stop him without putting herself at risk. Little did she know that help would come from an unexpected source, and her solution would be more creative than anything she could have imagined. After her disappointing meeting with the HOA board, Lisa thought maybe things would calm down. She was wrong. If anything, Rick seemed to take her complaint as a personal challenge. Within a week of her conversation with Janet, the citations and harassment escalated to a whole new level. The first escalation came on a cold November morning. Lisa was sipping her coffee and getting ready for work when she heard the familiar sound of tape being attached to something outside. She peeked through her window and saw Rick standing at her mailbox, carefully applying what looked like an official citation sticker to the side. When she went outside to investigate, she found a formal-looking document that made her blood boil. The citation claimed her mailbox was improperly positioned and violated Section 4.2b of the Neighborhood Compliance Code. According to Rick's notice, her mailbox was supposedly 3 inches too far from the curb and needed to be relocated within 7 days, or she'd face additional fines. Lisa had lived in this house for almost 2 years. Her mailbox had been in the exact same position since the day she moved in, and the postal worker had never complained about it. She grabbed a measuring tape from her garage and confirmed what she already knew. Her mailbox was positioned identically to every other mailbox on the street. But Rick wasn't done. Over the next few days, he found new and increasingly ridiculous reasons to cite her property. Her house number wasn't clearly visible enough despite being the same size and style as everyone else's. Her garbage can was allegedly placed on the curb 14 minutes too early before pickup day, even though she put it out at the same time she'd been doing for months. He even claimed her garden hose was creating a trip hazard because she'd left it coiled neatly beside her front steps. What made these citations especially infuriating was how official they looked. Rick had somehow gotten access to professional-looking forms with the HOA letterhead, complete serial numbers, and legal-sounding language that made them seem legitimate. Each citation included references to specific code sections and threatened escalating fines if violations weren't corrected immediately. Lisa decided to do some research. She spent an entire evening going through the actual HOA bylaws and community guidelines that she'd received when she bought her house. After reading every single page twice, she made a shocking discovery. Most of the violations Rick was citing didn't exist anywhere in the real HOA documentation. Section 4.2b, which supposedly governed mailbox positioning, didn't exist. There was no mention of specific timing requirements for garbage can placement. The trip hazard regulations he kept referencing were completely made up. Rick was literally inventing rules and then enforcing them as if they were legitimate community standards. Armed with this knowledge, Lisa decided to confront him directly. The next morning, she waited by her mailbox until she saw him starting his daily patrol rounds. When he approached with his notebook and measuring tape, she was ready. "Excuse me, Rick," she called out politely. "I wanted to discuss these citations you've been leaving." He looked up from his notebook with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted during important official business. "These are legitimate violations, ma'am. I suggest you address them promptly to avoid additional penalties." "Actually, I've been reading through the HOA guidelines," Lisa said, holding up her copy of the community rules. "I can't find any mention of Section 4.2b or most of these other regulations you're citing." Rick's face darkened slightly, but he maintained his authoritative tone. "Those are updated compliance standards that have been recently implemented. As the neighborhood compliance coordinator, I have the authority to enforce both existing and new regulations as needed. But shouldn't residents be notified when new rules are created?" Lisa pressed. "And shouldn't they be voted on by the community?" "Ma'am, I don't have time to explain every detail of HOA governance to individual residents," Rick replied curtly. "I suggest you contact the board if you have concerns about proper procedures." Then he did something that made Lisa's skin crawl. He pulled out his retired police badge, the one he wore on his jacket, and held it up so she could see it clearly. "I've been enforcing regulations and maintaining community standards for 30 years, he said slowly. "I think I know what I'm doing." The implicit threat was clear. He was using his law enforcement background to intimidate her into compliance, even though his police authority had ended the day he retired. But Lisa could see that this tactic probably worked on most of her neighbors, especially elderly residents like Mrs. Chen, who came from a generation that automatically respected police officers. After that confrontation, Rick's behavior became even more aggressive. He started showing up at her house multiple times per day, always finding new violations to document. Her car was parked improperly in her own driveway. Her porch light was too bright and creating light pollution. Even her doormat was supposedly positioned in violation of entrance safety protocols. The citations kept coming, and each one included increasing fine amounts. What started as $25 penalties had escalated to $50, then $75 per violation. Rick's notices warned that continued non-compliance could result in liens against her property and forced compliance measures. Lisa realized she was being systematically harassed, but the real gut punch came when she discovered Rick was also stealing her mail outright. One afternoon, she was expecting an important work document that needed to be returned by the end of the week. The sender confirmed it had been delivered, but when Lisa checked her mailbox, it wasn't there. She immediately set up her phone to record again, this time positioning it for a better view of the mailbox area. That night, the camera captured Rick not just going through her mail, but actually removing several pieces and walking away with them. Among the stolen items was her work document, which would now be late and could potentially cost her a client. The next morning, Lisa marched down to Rick's house and knocked on his door. When he answered, she could see her stolen mail sitting on a table behind him. "You took my mail," she said directly. "I have video proof and I want it back right now." Rick didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he launched into a speech about suspicious deliveries and his responsibility to investigate potential security threats in the neighborhood. According to him, he was protecting everyone by screening mail for dangerous or inappropriate content. "This is a federal crime," Lisa told him firmly. "Mail theft is serious and you know it." "Ma'am, I'm conducting legitimate security investigations," Rick replied with the same condescending tone he'd used before. "If you have concerns about my methods, you're welcome to file a complaint with the appropriate authorities." He knew exactly what he was doing. Rick understood that most people wouldn't want to get into a legal battle with a former police officer, especially when he had the backing of the HOA board. He was counting on Lisa being too intimidated or too busy to follow through on her threats, but Rick had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. Lisa wasn't the type of person to back down from bullies, whether they wore badges or not. As she walked back to her house with her stolen mail finally returned, she was already planning her next move. She contacted the postal inspector's office and filed a formal complaint about mail theft. The inspector she spoke with took the situation seriously and assured her that tampering with someone else's mail was indeed a federal offense that carried significant penalties. However, he also warned her that building a case would take time and required substantial evidence. Meanwhile, Rick continued his reign of terror throughout the neighborhood. Lisa started hearing from other residents who were dealing with similar harassment. Tom from down the street had been cited for having non-regulation holiday decorations when he put up simple Christmas lights. The young couple with the new baby received violations for excessive noise when their infant cried. During the day, most disturbing was what happened to Mrs. Chen. Rick had begun targeting her, specifically after Lisa's complaints, apparently viewing the elderly woman as an easy target. He cited her for everything from improper lawn maintenance to unauthorized bird feeding when she put seeds out for the cardinals that visited her yard. Lisa realized that Rick wasn't just harassing her anymore. He was systematically intimidating anyone who might challenge his authority or support her complaints against him. The neighborhood was slowly being transformed into his personal police state, and most residents were too scared or confused to fight back. Something had to be done, and Lisa was beginning to realize that traditional complaints and official channels weren't going to be enough to stop someone who believed his own authority was absolute. She needed a different approach, something that would catch Rick in the act and expose his behavior in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. She just had to figure out what that something would be. The situation with Rick reached an absolutely unacceptable level on a freezing December morning that Lisa would never forget. She had been dealing with his harassment for almost 3 months now, and just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, Rick crossed a line that changed everything. Lisa had been managing a chronic health condition that required daily medication. Nothing too serious, but the prescription was important for keeping her energy levels stable and preventing flare-ups that could interfere with her work. She always had her medications delivered to ensure she never ran out, and the pharmacy was very reliable about their delivery schedule. On this particular Tuesday, Lisa was expecting her monthly medication delivery. The pharmacy had confirmed it would arrive before noon, and she'd arranged to work from home that day to make sure she was available to receive it. These weren't the kind of pills you wanted sitting in a mailbox all day, especially in cold weather. Around 11:30, she heard the familiar sound of the delivery truck stopping outside her house. Through her window, she watched the driver place a small package in her mailbox and drive away. Perfect timing. She'd grab it during her lunch break in about an hour. But when Lisa went outside at 12:30, her mailbox was completely empty. At first, she thought maybe she'd misheard the delivery truck or maybe the driver had gone to the wrong address. She called the pharmacy to double-check, and they confirmed the package had been delivered to her correct address at exactly 11:32 a.m. The tracking information showed it as successfully delivered. Lisa felt a sick feeling in her stomach. She knew exactly what had happened, but she couldn't quite believe Rick would be bold enough to steal prescription medication. That wasn't just mail theft anymore, that was potentially dangerous. She marched straight down to Rick's house and pounded on his front door. When he answered, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You took my medication package," she said firmly. "I need it back right now." Rick looked at her with that same condescending expression she'd grown to hate. But instead of denying it like she expected, he actually seemed proud of what he'd done. "I confiscated a suspicious package that appeared to contain controlled substances," he said in his official-sounding voice. "As neighborhood compliance coordinator, I have a responsibility to investigate potential drug-related activities." Lisa stared at him in complete disbelief. "Those are my prescribed medications from my pharmacy. You have no right to take them." "Ma'am, I've seen too many drug operations disguised as legitimate deliveries," Rick replied, crossing his arms. I'm conducting a proper investigation to ensure this package contains what you claim it contains. Then open it right now and see for yourself, Lisa demanded. That's not how investigations work, Rick said smugly. I need to follow proper protocols and document everything appropriately. You can have your package back once I've completed my security review. Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. Rick was essentially holding her medication hostage based on completely fabricated authority. She knew he had no legal right to investigate anything, but he was acting like he was still a working police officer with real power. How long is this investigation going to take? She asked, trying to control her anger. Could be several days. Rick shrugged. Maybe a week. Depends on what I find and whether I need to consult with other authorities. Lisa realized she was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Rick genuinely seemed to believe he had the legal authority to confiscate people's property and conduct investigations. His retirement hadn't just ended his police career. It had apparently triggered some kind of power fantasy where he was still in charge of enforcing the law. This is insane, Lisa told him. You're not a police officer anymore. You have no authority to take anyone's property. Rick's face hardened, and he stepped closer to her in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. I have 30 years of law enforcement experience, he said slowly. I know suspicious activity when I see it, and I know how to handle residents who don't cooperate with legitimate security investigations. The threat was unmistakable. Rick was essentially telling her that if she continued to challenge him, things would get even worse for her. Lisa realized she was dealing with someone who was not just power-hungry, but potentially unstable. She left Rick's house feeling more frustrated and helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. She called the pharmacy to explain what had happened, and they were able to provide her with a few days' worth of medication to hold her over. But they also warned her that insurance wouldn't cover a replacement for the stolen package, meaning she'd have to pay out of pocket for her full prescription. That afternoon, Lisa called the postal inspector again to report the medication theft. The inspector was clearly concerned and assured her this was a serious escalation that would definitely be included in their investigation. He also suggested she file a police report about the theft, since prescription drugs were involved. But when Lisa went to the local police station, she ran into the same problem she'd encountered before. The desk sergeant listened to her story with obvious skepticism, especially when she mentioned that Rick was a retired officer from their own department. Look, lady, the sergeant said with barely concealed annoyance, Rick Patterson is a good cop who served this community for 3 decades. If he's investigating suspicious activity in your neighborhood, he's probably got good reason. Maybe you should focus on making sure your deliveries look legitimate instead of causing problems for a respected retired officer. Lisa left the police station feeling like she was living in some kind of alternate reality where everyone was willing to ignore obvious crimes because the person committing them used to wear a badge. She was starting to understand how people could feel completely powerless against corrupt authority figures. Over the next few days, Rick's behavior became even more erratic and controlling. He started positioning himself outside her house for hours at a time, claiming he was monitoring suspicious activity. When Lisa left for work in the morning, Rick would be sitting in his car across the street watching her house. When she came home in the evening, he'd still be there. The psychological pressure was enormous. Lisa felt like she was being watched constantly, and she couldn't do anything in her own yard without Rick scrutinizing her every move. He'd write notes in his little book whenever she brought in groceries, watered her plants, or even just checked her mail. It was like living under surveillance in her own home. Mrs. Chen confided that she was experiencing similar treatment. Rick had decided the elderly woman was somehow connected to Lisa's suspicious activities and had begun watching her house too. Mrs. Chen was so intimidated that she'd stopped gardening and rarely left her house. Except for essential errands, I don't understand. What happened to our nice, quiet neighborhood? Mrs. Chen said sadly during one of their conversations. I moved here because I thought it would be peaceful and safe. Now I'm afraid to step outside my own front door. Lisa realized that Rick's campaign of harassment was affecting more than just her own life. He was systematically intimidating anyone who might support her or challenge his authority. The man was turning their entire street into his personal kingdom, and most residents were too scared or confused to fight back. The final straw came when Lisa discovered Rick had created what he called neighborhood security protocols that he was trying to get other residents to follow. These included requirements for people to report any unusual activity they witnessed, restrictions on when residents could receive deliveries, and mandatory security interviews for anyone who had frequent visitors. Lisa found a copy of these protocols in her mailbox, along with a note informing her that she was now considered a person of interest in ongoing security investigations. The document looked official and included language about potential consequences for non-compliance, including possible involvement of appropriate federal authorities. Reading that document was Lisa's breaking point. She realized she wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry retiree anymore. Rick had created an entire fantasy world where he was still a working law enforcement officer, with the authority to control his neighbors' lives. He was living in a delusion, and that delusion was making life miserable for everyone around him. Traditional approaches weren't working. The HOA board supported Rick. The local police dismissed her complaints, and the postal inspector's investigation was moving too slowly to help. Lisa needed a solution that would force Rick to confront the reality of his situation while protecting herself and her neighbors from further harassment. She just had to figure out what that solution would look like. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. For Lisa, that place turned out to be her brother's kitchen table during what was supposed to be a normal family dinner. Lisa had been dreading this monthly family gathering because she knew everyone would ask how things were going with her new house. She didn't want to spend the entire evening complaining about Rick and his harassment. But she was so stressed and exhausted that she couldn't hide her frustration anymore. Her brother Danny had always been the creative problem solver in the family. While Lisa was methodical and organized, Danny was the one who thought outside the box and came up with unconventional solutions to everyday problems. He worked as a part-time handyman and spent his free time pursuing various hobbies that changed every few months. Currently, he was obsessed with beekeeping. Danny had started keeping bees the previous spring after watching a documentary about declining bee populations. What began as an environmental concern had turned into a genuine passion. He'd set up several hives on the property behind his house and spent hours talking to anyone who would listen about the fascinating social structure of bee colonies. During dinner, Lisa finally broke down and told her family everything that had been happening with Rick. She explained about the mail theft, the fake citations, the stolen medication, and the constant surveillance that was making her life miserable. By the time she finished her story, everyone at the table was outraged on her behalf. "This guy sounds completely nuts," said her sister-in-law Jenny. "Isn't there anything the police can do?" "They don't take it seriously because he used to be one of them," Lisa explained. "And the HOA board thinks he's wonderful because he makes the neighborhood look secure and well-maintained." Their father suggested hiring a lawyer, but Lisa had already looked into that option. The legal fees would be enormous, and even if she won, it would take months or years to resolve. Meanwhile, Rick would continue making her life hell. "What you need is something that will make him stop immediately," Danny said thoughtfully. "Something that will catch him in the act and make sure he never wants to mess with your mailbox again." "Like what?" Lisa asked. "I've already tried cameras and that didn't scare him off." Danny was quiet for a moment, and Lisa could see that look in his eyes that meant he was working on an idea. She'd seen that expression countless times growing up, usually right before Danny announced some crazy plan that somehow actually worked. "What if we could create a situation where opening your mailbox had immediate consequences?" Danny said slowly. "Something that would be completely legal for you to do, but would make Rick think twice about continuing his little investigation routine." "What kind of consequences?" Lisa asked. Danny grinned, and Lisa knew he'd thought of something either brilliant or completely insane. "Probably both." "Bees," Danny said simply. Everyone at the table stared at him for a moment before Lisa's mother started laughing. "Danny, honey, you can't put bees in someone's mailbox," she said. "That's dangerous." "Not if it's done right," Danny replied, his excitement growing as he explained his idea. "Listen, bees are actually very gentle creatures when they're not protecting their hive. But if someone suddenly opens a space where bees are resting, they get startled and defensive. It's a natural reaction." Lisa wasn't sure if she was horrified or intrigued by the suggestion. "Are you seriously proposing that I booby-trap my mailbox with live bees?" Not exactly booby trap, Danny explained. More like, create a temporary bee habitat that happens to be in your mailbox. If Rick has legitimate reasons to be there, like delivering mail, then he wouldn't disturb them. But if someone opens the mailbox who shouldn't be there, they get a face full of angry bees, Lisa finished. It's poetic justice, Jenny added. The punishment fits the crime. Lisa had to admit there was a certain appeal to the idea. Rick had been terrorizing the neighborhood with his fake authority for months. The thought of him getting a taste of real consequences for his actions was definitely satisfying. But she had concerns about the practicality and safety of Danny's plan. Wouldn't that be dangerous? She asked. What if Rick is allergic to bee stings? That's actually the beauty of it, Danny explained. Bees don't want to sting people. Stinging kills the bee, so they only do it as a last resort. If someone opened the mailbox and then immediately backed away, the bees would probably just fly off to find a new place to rest. They'd only sting if someone kept trying to swat at them or trap them. Danny went on to explain that he could set up a small temporary colony using bees that were naturally docile. He'd done it before when moving bees between hives, and it was completely safe as long as the person handling them knew what they were doing. Plus, Danny added, it's not illegal to keep bees on your own property. If Rick complains to anyone, he'd have to admit he was going through your mail to encounter them in the first place. Lisa was starting to warm up to the idea, but she wanted to make sure they could do it safely and legally. She spent the rest of the evening asking Danny detailed questions about bee behavior, safety precautions, and how exactly they could modify her mailbox to accommodate temporary bee residents. Danny explained that bees are most active during the day and tend to cluster together quietly at night. If they set up the bee habitat in the evening, the bees would settle in and remain calm unless disturbed. Anyone opening the mailbox during their resting period would definitely get their attention, but the bees would be more interested in escaping than attacking. The key is making sure the bees have an easy way out, Danny said. If they feel trapped, that's when they get aggressive. But if they can see an escape route, they'll usually take it instead of fighting. Over the next few days, Lisa couldn't stop thinking about Danny's bee plan. The more she considered it, the more it seemed like the perfect solution to her Rick problem. It was legal, it was creative, and it would provide undeniable proof that Rick was illegally accessing her mailbox. Most importantly, it would give him an immediate and memorable reason to stay away from her property. Lisa also realized that the bee plan would solve another major problem she'd been struggling with: documentation. Even though she had video evidence of Rick's mail theft, it was just her word against his about what was happening in those recordings. But if Rick got stung by bees while going through her mail, there would be no way for him to explain away his presence at her mailbox in the middle of the night. She called Danny and told him she wanted to move forward with the plan. They spent several phone conversations working out the details and safety precautions. Danny assured her that he could set up a small group of bees that would be calm and manageable, and he'd be available immediately if anything went wrong. They decided to implement the plan on a Friday evening, giving them the weekend to monitor the situation and make adjustments if needed. Danny would bring over a special container designed for temporary bee housing, along with all the safety equipment they might need. Lisa spent the week preparing by researching bee behavior and safety procedures. She wanted to make sure she understood exactly what they were doing and what the potential risks were. She also set up additional cameras to capture everything that happened, positioning them to get clear footage of her mailbox area from multiple angles. The more Lisa learned about bees, the more confident she became in their plan. Bees really were gentle creatures that preferred to avoid conflict. They'd only become defensive if they felt their colony was threatened, and even then, they'd usually choose to flee rather than fight if given the option. By Thursday evening, Lisa was ready to put Danny's bee plan into action. She was nervous but excited about finally having a way to fight back against Rick's harassment. After months of feeling powerless and frustrated, she was about to turn the tables on her neighborhood bully in a way he'd never forget. She just hoped the bees would be as cooperative as Danny promised they would be. Friday evening couldn't come fast enough for Lisa. She'd spent the entire week mentally rehearsing Danny's bee plan, going over every detail until she could picture exactly how everything would work. She was nervous but determined. After months of Rick's harassment, she was finally going to do something that would put an end to his mail theft once and for all. Danny arrived at her house just as the sun was setting, driving his old pickup truck with several wooden boxes and containers in the back. He looked like he was heading out on some kind of nature expedition, wearing a light-colored jacket, thick gloves, and carrying what looked like a small smoker device that beekeepers use to calm their hives. "You ready for this?" Danny asked as he unloaded his equipment. Lisa nodded, though her heart was beating faster than usual. "I've been ready for months. Let's do this." The first step was modifying Lisa's mailbox to accommodate their temporary bee residence. Danny had brought a special insert that would create a hidden chamber inside the mailbox, while still leaving room for actual mail delivery. The design was clever. From the outside, everything would look completely normal, but anyone opening the main compartment would get a surprise. "The real mail will go through this slot," Danny explained, showing Lisa a narrow opening he'd created in the insert. "Your postal worker will be able to make deliveries without disturbing our little friends. But if someone opens the main compartment, they meet the welcoming committee," Lisa finished with a grin. Danny had brought about 50 bees in a special transport container. He explained that this was a small group compared to a full hive, but more than enough to make a strong impression on anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. These particular bees were from one of his gentlest colonies, known for being calm and slow to anger. "Remember, bees don't want to sting people," Danny reminded her as they worked. "Stinging means death for the bee, so they only do it if they feel completely threatened. These ladies will be much more interested in finding a way out than starting a fight." While Danny prepared the bee chamber, Lisa double-checked her camera setup. She'd positioned 3 different cameras to capture the mailbox area from multiple angles, including one that would clearly show anyone's face as they approached. She'd also set up motion sensors that would send alerts to both her phone and Danny's, so they'd know immediately when something happened. The most important part of their system was the remote monitoring setup. Danny had rigged a small device that would detect when the mailbox was opened and instantly send notifications to both of them. If Rick showed up for his usual late-night mail inspection, they'd know about it within seconds. "Okay, the moment of truth," Danny said, carefully transferring the bees into their new temporary home. The bees seemed surprisingly calm about the whole process, clustering together in a tight group inside the hidden chamber. "They'll settle in over the next hour or so. By the time Rick makes his rounds tonight, they'll be nice and cozy." Lisa watched in fascination as the bees organized themselves in their new space. They moved with purpose, but without any sense of panic or aggression. It was actually quite peaceful to observe, which made her feel better about the whole plan. "What happens if they decide they don't like it in there?" Lisa asked. "Then they'll leave," Danny replied simply. "That's the beauty of working with bees. You can't force them to do anything they don't want to do. If this spot doesn't work for them, they'll find somewhere else to go. But based on the setup, I think they'll be happy here for at least a few days." Once the bees were settled, Danny showed Lisa how to use the mail slot for legitimate deliveries. The system worked perfectly. She could insert and remove mail through the narrow slot without disturbing the main chamber where the bees were resting. "Your postal worker tomorrow morning will never even know they're there," Danny assured her. "The slot is positioned so that normal mail delivery won't bother them at all." They spent another hour testing all the camera angles and notification systems to make sure everything was working properly. Lisa felt like she was preparing for some kind of elaborate spy operation, which wasn't far from the truth. After months of being the victim of Rick's surveillance, she was finally turning the tables. As darkness fell, Danny packed up his equipment and prepared to leave. He'd be monitoring the situation from his house, ready to come back immediately if anything went wrong. Lisa had his phone number on speed dial, and they'd established a simple code system for text messages in case they needed to communicate quickly. "Remember, once this happens, there's no going back," Danny warned her. "Rick is going to know that someone set this up deliberately. Are you sure you're ready for whatever comes next?" Lisa thought about all the months of harassment, the stolen mail, the fake citations, and especially the confiscated medication that could have seriously affected her health. She thought about Mrs. Chen being too scared to garden in her own yard, and all the other neighbors who were living in fear of Rick's imaginary authority. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "It's time someone showed Rick that he can't just terrorize people without consequences." Danny nodded and gave her a quick hug. "Then let's see how much Rick really enjoys conducting his unauthorized mail investigations." After Danny left, Lisa settled in for what she expected to be a long wait. Based on her previous observations, Rick usually made his mail rounds between 10 and 11 p.m. when most of the neighborhood was winding down for the night. She positioned herself in her living room with a clear view of the mailbox and her phone ready to receive notifications. The waiting was almost unbearable. Every little sound outside made her heart jump, wondering if this was finally the moment when Rick would get his comeuppance. She tried to distract herself by reading and watching TV, but she couldn't focus on anything except the anticipation of what was about to happen. Around 9:30, Lisa's phone buzzed with a motion sensor alert. She looked out her window and saw Rick beginning his evening patrol, walking slowly down the street with his flashlight and notebook. Her pulse quickened as she watched him stop at various houses, checking mailboxes and writing notes with his usual self-important demeanor. He was taking his time tonight, spending extra minutes at each house as if he was conducting particularly thorough investigations. Lisa realized he was probably enjoying the power trip of examining everyone's private mail, completely unaware that his reign of terror was about to come to a very abrupt end. As Rick moved closer to her house, Lisa could feel her excitement and nervousness building. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, but now that it was actually happening, the reality of the situation hit her. In just a few minutes, Rick would approach her mailbox expecting to find the usual assortment of letters and packages to snoop through. Instead, he was going to get the surprise of his lifetime. Lisa's phone was ready to record everything. Her cameras were positioned perfectly, and somewhere inside her mailbox, 50 peaceful bees were resting quietly, completely unaware that they were about to become the heroes of the neighborhood. All that was left now was to wait for Rick to walk into the trap that would finally end his campaign of harassment once and for all. At exactly 10:47 p.m., Lisa's phone buzzed with the notification she'd been waiting for all evening. The motion sensor had detected movement near her mailbox. Her heart started pounding as she looked out her window and saw Rick approaching with his usual confident swagger, flashlight in one hand and his little citation notebook in the other. Lisa quickly opened the camera app on her phone to start recording. Even though her fixed cameras were already capturing everything, she wanted to make sure she had multiple angles of what was about to happen. After months of feeling helpless against Rick's harassment, she was finally going to see him get exactly what he deserved. Rick walked up to her mailbox with the same entitled attitude he'd displayed every night for months. He looked around briefly to make sure no one was watching, then reached for the mailbox handle with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had every right to be there. Lisa held her breath as Rick opened the mailbox door. For about half a second, everything was quiet. Rick leaned forward to peer inside the mailbox with his flashlight, probably expecting to see the usual collection of letters and packages to rifle through. Instead, he found himself face to face with 50 very startled and increasingly agitated bees. What happened next was absolutely beautiful. The bees, who had been resting peacefully in their temporary home, suddenly found themselves exposed to bright light and the presence of an unwelcome intruder. Just as Danny had predicted, their first instinct wasn't to attack, it was to escape. But Rick, in his shock and panic, made the worst possible decision. Instead of calmly stepping back and allowing the bees to fly away, Rick let out a loud yelp and started swatting wildly at the emerging swarm. This aggressive behavior triggered the bees' defensive instincts, and they quickly shifted from escape mode to protection mode. The scene that unfolded was like something out of a slapstick comedy, except Lisa couldn't help but feel that Rick had brought every bit of this on himself. He stumbled backward from the mailbox, flailing his arms frantically as bees swirled around his head and shoulders. "What the hell?" Rick shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Get away from me! Get away!" But the more Rick flailed and swatted, the more agitated the bees became. They weren't trying to hurt him. They just wanted him to stop threatening their temporary home. Unfortunately, Rick was too panicked to understand that standing still would have ended the whole encounter in seconds. Lisa watched through her window as Rick stumbled backward across her front yard, windmilling his arms and shouting at the top of his lungs. In his panic, he completely lost his footing and crashed directly into her carefully maintained flower bed, landing flat on his back among her prized roses. The impact sent his flashlight flying in one direction and his citation notebook in another. Rick rolled around in the flower bed like he was on fire, crushing several of Lisa's favorite plants while continuing to bat ineffectively at the bees that were now mostly just trying to get away from this loud, thrashing human. "Help," "Someone help me!" Rick screamed from the middle of the flower bed. "I'm being attacked." "This is assault." Lisa had to bite her lip to keep from laughing out loud. After months of Rick terrorizing the neighborhood with his fake authority and imaginary police powers, seeing him reduced to a panicking mess rolling around in her flowers was incredibly satisfying. The bees, having successfully defended their territory, were already beginning to disperse. Most of them flew off into the night to find a quieter place to rest, though a few lingered near the mailbox as if standing guard against future intruders. Rick finally managed to extract himself from the flower bed, looking absolutely ridiculous with dirt in his hair, rose thorns stuck to his jacket, and the expression of complete shock and outrage on his face. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily and looking around as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. But here's where things got even better for Lisa. In his panic and confusion, Rick apparently forgot that he wasn't supposed to be at her mailbox in the first place. Instead of quietly retreating and hoping no one had witnessed his humiliating encounter, he started shouting about calling the police and filing charges. "This is entrapment." Rick yelled toward Lisa's house, apparently assuming she was responsible. "You can't booby-trap a mailbox. That's illegal. I'm calling this in right now." Lisa's cameras were capturing every word, and Rick was essentially confessing to mail theft while covered in dirt and rose thorns. He pulled out his phone and actually started dialing, apparently planning to report the very crime he'd just been caught committing. "Weaven, this is Detective Rick Patterson. Badge number," Rick began, then stopped as he apparently remembered he didn't have a badge number anymore. "I mean, this is retired Detective Rick Patterson. I need to report an assault in progress." Lisa couldn't believe Rick was actually calling the police on himself. She quickly texted Danny to let him know what was happening and to get over to her house as soon as possible. This was turning out even better than they'd planned. Rick spent several minutes on the phone with the 911 operator, trying to explain that he'd been conducting legitimate security investigations when he was viciously attacked by weaponized insects. Even from inside her house, Lisa could hear the frustration in his voice as he apparently struggled to make his story sound believable. "No, I wasn't breaking into anything," Rick insisted loudly. "I'm the neighborhood compliance coordinator. I have authority to inspect mailboxes for security violations." Lisa realized that Rick was so deep in his fantasy of being a legitimate authority figure that he genuinely believed his own lies. He actually thought he could call the police and report Lisa for defending her own property against his illegal intrusions. When the police finally arrived about 15 minutes later, Rick was still standing in Lisa's front yard, brushing dirt off his clothes and pointing dramatically at her mailbox as if it were some kind of dangerous weapon. Lisa had used the time to review her video footage and prepare a complete documentation package of Rick's months of harassment. The two officers who responded looked skeptical from the moment they stepped out of their patrol car. Rick immediately launched into a lengthy explanation about his official duties and the unprovoked bee attack he'd suffered while conducting legitimate mail security protocols. One of the officers, a young woman who clearly had little patience for Rick's dramatic presentation, cut him off mid-sentence. "Sir, let me understand this correctly," she said. "You're claiming you were attacked by bees while inspecting someone else's mailbox at 11 o'clock at night?" "I was conducting security investigations as authorized by the Homeowners Association," Rick replied pompously. "Do you have written authorization to open other people's mailboxes?" the second officer asked. Rick's confident expression faltered slightly. "I have 30 years of law enforcement experience. I know what authority I have." Lisa decided this was the perfect time to make her entrance. She stepped outside with her phone, her video evidence, and a folder full of documentation about Rick's months of harassment. "Officers," she said calmly, "I think you need to see this footage of what really happened here tonight." The look on Rick's face when he realized Lisa had video evidence of everything was absolutely priceless. His imaginary authority was about to collide headfirst with actual reality, and Lisa was going to enjoy every second of it. The look on Rick's face when Lisa appeared with her phone and folder of evidence was something she would remember for the rest of her life. His expression went from indignant outrage to panic to complete confusion in about 3 seconds. It was like watching someone realize they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing a completely different game. "Officers, Before you listen to whatever story he's told you, I think you need to see this, Lisa said, holding up her phone with the crystal-clear video of Rick opening her mailbox. The female officer, whose name tag read Martinez, looked intrigued. What exactly are we looking at, ma'am? Lisa started the video from the beginning, showing Rick approaching her mailbox with his flashlight and notebook. The footage was perfect. You could clearly see his face, his deliberate movements, and the confident way he reached for the mailbox handle as if he had every right to be there. This video was taken tonight at exactly 10:47 p.m., Lisa explained. As you can see, this man is opening my mailbox without permission. Officer Martinez watched the screen intently as the video showed Rick opening the mailbox, the bees emerging, and his subsequent panic-induced tumble into the flower bed. Despite the serious nature of the situation, Lisa noticed both officers struggling not to smile at Rick's dramatic flailing and his ungraceful crash landing among the roses. Sir, the second officer said to Rick, can you explain why you were opening this woman's mailbox at nearly 11 o'clock at night? Rick's face was getting redder by the minute. I told you, I'm the neighborhood compliance coordinator. I have the authority to inspect mailboxes for security violations and suspicious activity. Do you have any written documentation of this authority? Officer Martinez asked. Rick fumbled in his pockets and pulled out a laminated card that Lisa had never seen before. I have my official HOA identification card. Officer Martinez examined the card and Lisa could see her trying not to roll her eyes. Sir, this appears to be a homemade ID card with your photo glued to it. This doesn't give you authority to open other people's mailboxes. But I have 30 years of police experience, Rick protested. I know how to conduct proper investigations. Sir, being a retired police officer doesn't give you authority to investigate anything, the second officer explained patiently. And opening someone else's mailbox without permission is a federal crime, regardless of your background. Lisa pulled out her folder and handed it to Officer Martinez. This isn't the first time this has happened. I have documentation of months of harassment, mail theft, and property violations. As Officer Martinez flipped through Lisa's carefully organized evidence folder, her expression grew more serious. Lisa had included printed screenshots from her security cameras, showing Rick going through her mail on multiple occasions, copies of the fake citations he'd been leaving, and documentation of the stolen prescription medication incident. Ma'am, how long has this been going on? Officer Martinez asked. About 4 months, Lisa replied. It started small with just rearranged mail, but it escalated to him actually stealing packages and prescription medications. Rick was clearly getting desperate as he watched the officers reviewing the evidence against him. Those are all legitimate security investigations. Ask the HOA board. They'll confirm my authority. Lisa almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Rick genuinely seemed to believe his own delusions about having official authority. But then she remembered all the sleepless nights, the stress, the stolen medication, and poor Mrs. Chen being too afraid to leave her house. Officers, there's more, Lisa said. I suspect this isn't just happening to me. She pulled out her phone again and showed them additional footage she'd compiled over the past few weeks. The cameras she'd set up to monitor her own mailbox had also captured Rick visiting other houses throughout the neighborhood, systematically going through multiple residents' mail. Oh my God, Officer Martinez said as she watched Rick moving from mailbox to mailbox like he was conducting some kind of organized search operation. This guy has been doing this to the entire neighborhood. The second officer was already on his radio, calling for backup and requesting a supervisor. What had started as a simple complaint about someone getting stung by bees was rapidly turning into a major federal mail theft investigation. Sir, I need you to remain here while we sort this out, Officer Martinez told Rick firmly. And I need you to understand that you're potentially facing very serious federal charges. Rick's confident demeanor finally cracked completely. Federal charges? But I'm a retired police officer. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Sir, retired police officers are private citizens, Officer Martinez explained. You have no more authority to open mailboxes than any other resident. And tampering with mail is a federal crime regardless of your intentions. While they waited for backup, Lisa shared more details about Rick's campaign of harassment. She showed the officers the fake citations with made-up violation codes, explained about the prescription medication theft, and described how Rick had been intimidating elderly residents like Mrs. Chen. Danny arrived during this conversation. still wearing his beekeeping gear and carrying his bee smoker. His timing was perfect. Several bees were still lingering around the mailbox area, and he was able to safely encourage them to leave before anyone else got stung. "Ma'am, was this some kind of trap you set for this individual?" Officer Martinez asked Lisa. Lisa had been preparing for this question all week. "I keep bees on my property for pollination purposes," she said, which was technically true since Danny's hives were considered part of their family property arrangements. "I had no way of knowing that anyone would illegally open my mailbox." Danny backed up her story, explaining that bees sometimes cluster in unusual places when they're scouting for new hive locations. It was perfectly plausible that bees might temporarily take up residence in a mailbox, especially if it provided shelter from wind and rain. The beauty of their plan was that everything was completely legal. Lisa had every right to have bees on her property, and Rick had no right to be opening her mailbox. If he'd been making legitimate mail deliveries during normal hours, he never would have encountered the bees in the first place. When the supervisor arrived, along with a detective from the mail theft unit, the scope of Rick's activities became even clearer. The detective had Lisa walk through the entire timeline of harassment, and she realized that Rick's behavior had been escalating in a pattern that suggested he was becoming increasingly detached from reality. "This isn't just mail theft," the detective observed. "This individual appears to have been conducting some kind of elaborate fantasy investigation, targeting multiple residents over an extended period. They decided to canvass the neighborhood immediately to determine how many other residents had been affected. Lisa volunteered to help identify houses where she'd seen Rick conducting his unauthorized mail inspections. What they discovered over the next 2 hours was shocking. Nearly every house on Lisa's street and several houses on surrounding streets had been victims of Rick's systematic mail theft operation. Residents came forward with stories of missing packages, delayed important documents, and mysterious citations for violations that didn't exist in any official HOA documentation. Mrs. Chen tearfully described how Rick had been taking her medical correspondence, causing her to miss important appointments because she never received the reminder notices. A young couple down the street had missed their mortgage payment because Rick had confiscated the bill, claiming he was investigating suspicious banking activities. Elderly man across the street revealed that Rick had been taking his veterans benefits mail and holding it for security review. A single mother had been missing child support payments because Rick deemed them suspicious cash transfers that required investigation. As the scope of Rick's activities became clear, Lisa realized she'd uncovered something much bigger than simple mail theft. Rick had been conducting an elaborate surveillance and control operation against the entire neighborhood, using his fake authority to steal, intimidate, and manipulate dozens of families. The federal mail theft charges were just the beginning. Rick was also facing potential charges for impersonating a police officer, theft, harassment, and a dozen other violations that had affected nearly 50 households. As dawn broke and the investigation continued, Lisa felt a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. What had started as a simple plan to catch one mail thief had exposed a neighborhood-wide scheme that had been operating for months under everyone's noses. The bees had done more than just sting Rick. They'd brought down an entire fake law enforcement operation. The weeks following Rick's arrest were like watching dominoes fall in the most satisfying way possible. Lisa had expected some consequences for the former HOA compliance coordinator, but what actually happened exceeded her wildest dreams of justice being served. The federal postal inspectors didn't mess around when it came to mail theft. Within 72 hours of Rick's arrest, they had executed a search warrant on his house that revealed the true scope of his operation. What they found in Rick's garage was absolutely mind-blowing. Rick had essentially created a command center for his neighborhood surveillance activities. He had filing cabinets full of stolen mail, organized by address and resident name. There were detailed charts tracking everyone's daily routines, notes about suspicious activities that existed only in Rick's imagination, and even photographs he'd taken of residents going about their normal lives. Most disturbing was Rick's journal, where he documented his delusions about being an active law enforcement officer conducting legitimate investigations. He'd written detailed reports about imaginary criminal activities, complete with case numbers and official-sounding language. Reading through his notes, It became clear that Rick had completely lost touch with reality and genuinely believed he was still a working police detective. The postal inspectors estimated that Rick had stolen over 300 pieces of mail from 47 different households over a period of 6 months. The financial impact was enormous. Residents had missed bill payments, lost insurance coverage, failed to receive government benefits, and experienced countless other problems because their mail never reached them. Lisa's stolen prescription medication was just the tip of the iceberg. Rick had been taking medical correspondence from elderly residents throughout the neighborhood, causing some of them to miss critical appointments and medication refills. The fact that his actions could have seriously endangered people's health made the charges against him much more severe. The HOA board called an emergency meeting 3 days after Rick's arrest, and Lisa made sure to attend. The atmosphere in the community center was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Dozens of residents who had been suffering in silence for months finally had the chance to share their stories and demand answers. Janet, the HOA board president who had initially dismissed Lisa's complaints, looked absolutely mortified as resident after resident described how Rick's harassment had affected their lives. The board clearly had no idea how far Rick's activities had extended, and they were facing the possibility of massive legal liability for enabling his behavior. "We had no knowledge of the scope of Mr. Patterson's activities," Janet said weakly. "We thought he was simply helping to maintain community standards." "By going through people's mail?" demanded Mrs. Chen, who had found her voice now that Rick was no longer a threat. "By stealing medical documents and prescription medications?" The room erupted in angry voices as residents shared their experiences. The young couple whose mortgage payment had been stolen, the veteran whose benefits mail had been confiscated, the single mother whose child support had gone missing, the elderly man whose Social Security correspondence had been taken for investigation. Lisa stood up to address the room, and everyone fell silent. She'd become something of a neighborhood hero after exposing Rick's operation, and people wanted to hear what she had to say. "I think we need to talk about how this happened," Lisa said calmly. "Rick didn't hide what he was doing. He was openly harassing residents, leaving fake citations and acting like he had authority he didn't possess. But when I tried to report it, I was told I was overreacting." She looked directly at Janet and the other board members. The board gave Rick legitimacy by appointing him to a position that didn't actually exist and then refusing to investigate when residents complained. "You enabled this situation by putting your trust in someone's law enforcement background instead of listening to the people he was harassing." The legal consequences for the HOA were swift and expensive. Within 2 weeks, the board was facing multiple lawsuits from affected residents seeking damages for the harassment, theft, and emotional distress they'd experienced under Rick's reign of terror. Lisa consulted with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and learned that the association could be held liable for Rick's actions since they had given him apparent authority to act on their behalf. The fact that board members had dismissed legitimate complaints and failed to investigate obvious red flags made their liability even greater. The settlement negotiations took several months, but the final result was everything Lisa and her neighbors could have hoped for. The HOA agreed to pay substantial damages to all affected residents, implement new oversight procedures for any volunteer positions, and completely restructure their complaint process to ensure that resident concerns would be taken seriously in the future. More importantly, the HOA was required to conduct background checks and provide proper training for any volunteer positions, with clear written guidelines about what authority, if any, volunteers would have. Never again would someone like Rick be able to create their own job description and terrorize an entire neighborhood. Rick's criminal trial was a fascinating study in delusion meeting reality. His lawyer tried to argue that Rick genuinely believed he had authority to conduct his mail inspections, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The video footage of him going through dozens of mailboxes, combined with the stolen mail found in his house, made his guilt undeniable. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who couldn't accept the end of his police career and had created an elaborate fantasy world where he was still in charge of law enforcement. Rick's behavior had escalated over time as his delusions grew stronger, eventually leading him to believe he could steal mail, harass residents, and intimidate anyone who challenged his imaginary authority. Rick was ultimately sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for mail theft, plus additional time for related charges including impersonating a police officer and harassment. He was also required to pay restitution to all the residents he'd victimized and was banned from holding any position of authority in homeowners associations. The trial made local news, and Lisa found herself briefly famous as the woman who caught a mail thief using bees. Reporters loved the story, especially the poetic justice of Rick's downfall being caused by the very mailbox he'd been illegally accessing for months. Danny's beekeeping hobby suddenly became very popular in the neighborhood. Several residents asked him about setting up their own hives, though Lisa suspected their interest had more to do with home security than honey production. Danny was happy to share his knowledge and help people understand that bees were actually gentle, beneficial creatures when treated with respect. The bees themselves became something of a neighborhood legend. Danny had safely relocated them to one of his established hives, where they continued to thrive and produce honey. Lisa liked to think they were proud of their role in bringing down a neighborhood bully, though Danny assured her that bees don't hold grudges or celebrate victories the way humans do. Mrs. Chen became one of Lisa's closest friends after the whole ordeal. The elderly woman had been so grateful for Lisa's courage in standing up to Rick that she insisted on teaching Lisa her secret recipe for homemade dumplings. They spent many weekend afternoons gardening together and sharing stories about their lives. The neighborhood gradually returned to the peaceful, friendly community it had been before Rick's appointment as compliance coordinator. Children rode their bikes freely again. Residents felt comfortable checking their mail without looking over their shoulders, and people actually began talking to each other instead of hiding behind closed doors. Lisa kept her security cameras up and running, but more out of general home security than any specific fear. She'd learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to document everything, gather evidence, and then fight back using creativity and determination. The mailbox returned to normal operations, though Lisa always smiled when she saw bees in her garden. Danny visited regularly to check on her new hobby hives, and the neighborhood kids loved learning about bee behavior and honey production. Most importantly, Lisa had learned that standing up to corruption and abuse of power was worth the effort, even when it seemed impossible. Rick had counted on people being too intimidated or too busy to challenge his authority, but he hadn't counted on someone stubborn enough to fight back with the help of 50 very determined bees. The neighborhood was safer, the residents were more connected, and somewhere in Danny's apiary, a small group of bees continued their important work, forever remembered as the tiny heroes who proved that even the smallest creatures can make the biggest difference when justice is on their side.